HanselMinutes.com, it's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman, hosted by Carl Franklin. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 119, recorded live Wednesday, June 18th, 2008. Support for Hansel Minutes is provided by Telerik RAD Controls, the most comprehensive suite of components for Windows Forms and ASP.NET web applications. Online at www.telerik.com. And by the Code Better blog network, delivering tried-and-true solutions to real-world problems for building better software. Online at codebetter.com. Support is also provided by .NET Developers Journal, the world's leading .NET developer magazine. Online at www.sys-con.com. In this episode, Scott talks with Scrum creator and founder of the Agile Alliance, Ken Schwaber.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman, and this is another episode of Hansel Minutes, and I'm sitting here in Oslo, Norway with Ken Schwaber, the co-inventor of Scrum, founder of the Agile Alliance, and all-around Agile advocate. We were lucky enough to be on an Agile panel this morning with a number of Agile luminaries, but I'm sitting down here with Ken, and we're going to talk about Agile, agility, software process. But you had said, sir, that you thought that one of the things that needed to be talked about was what is done.
Yes.
Which was surprising to me that was what you thought was the most interesting thing we should talk about. What is the definition of done?
Well, done is a very simple word, and Bill Clinton started us with simple words when he talked about is during his presidency. Done is something where if I come into a company and they say, oh, we're using Scrum, it's a smell for me about whether they're using Scrum or not. So if I turn to the person who's a customer or even the team, and I say, what is your definition of done? And they give me kind of a blank look. To me, this is a smell that they haven't addressed one of the key issues in Scrum. And that is when they select some items that they are going to do for a sprint, that is, some items, some requirements, some product backlog items, some stories that they've said that they will do for the customer during an iteration, which we call a sprint, and they don't know what done or do is. This certainly raises a question to me about how they know what they're doing. Because if they don't know what done is, that is it coded? Is it unit tested after it's been coded? Is maybe even refactored? Does it include a design review, a code review? Does it include performance testing? What does it include? And if that person or that team that's working on things for the customer doesn't know what done is, then you have to ask a question about how do they know how many things they should select during an iteration? If it's just coded and maybe unit tested, maybe they can do 10 or 12 or maybe even 20 items during a whole sprint. If it is, though, both analyzed, designed, there's been a unit test, there's been coding, there's been testing, there's been refactoring, and the whole set of things that are needed to be done for it to be potentially shippable, then maybe they could only do one thing. So you have to wonder how they know how many things to select from the product backlog to do if they don't know what done is. This also raises the question of what sort of expertise or engineering skills do they have if they're not sure what they do when they select something to be done. And this, of course, then raises the question of undone work. When they get done with a sprint and they've done 5 things for a product owner, the product owner, if maybe the total of done things that they need are 30, might believe that they're 1/6 of the way complete and ready for shipment. However, if the team's definition of done is only coded and unit tested, maybe the product owner is only 1/40th of the way done. And when the team gets done with the 6th sprint and says, here we are, product owner, we're done, and the product owner says, great, let's ship, then the team has to look him in the eye and say, well, that's not quite the definition of done we had. Now we've got to do all the rest of the testing and the refactoring and the stabilizing of the code to make it so it's really shippable. So maybe in about 2 or 3 months. So this is why done for me tends to be a pretty big issue of engineering skills, of of the relationship between the product owner and the customer, and engineering competence of the team that's doing the work.
It sounds like, from the way that you're painting it, that done is the only point. I mean, if it also seems like one could build up a great deal of technical debt, even within just a few short iterations. But more importantly, that sitting down and at step zero saying what is done for us could expose a number of technical deficiencies in an organization. You're really you're illustrating that there could be a cancer in the organization. Like we have virtually no technical writing, or we have, insufficient integration testing. So we might not even be able to appropriately begin a sprint until we work these other things out.
Well, if I listed the number of things to be done to a customer requirement before it's potentially shippable, I've tried that, and the list is about 45 to 50 items, things that need to be done. And if a team is only capable, if you go through this with a group of engineers, group of developers, which includes programmers, analysts, designers, QA people, documentation people, and say, how much of this can you do in a sprint? It's very often that they can only do 15 or 20. They're going to look at a whole bunch of those, like the performance testing, the quality testing, the regression testing, and they're going to say, well, we don't know how to do that yet in a sprint. And to me, that remains undone work. If I do 6 sprints, at the end of the first sprint, I have some undone work. At the end of the second sprint, I have some undone work, and it keeps accumulating. Unfortunately, it doesn't accumulate linearly. As you don't do work sprint after sprint, it piles on. So you're not doing some work that's piling onto what you didn't do in the first sprint, third sprint, second sprint. And so the amount of work that you're not doing tends to accumulate in some sort of logarithmic pattern. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's certainly more than linear.
Interesting. It feels like when I did my first Scrum, when the CTO of the company that I worked at before I went to work for Microsoft brought in some Scrum training, and we had a number of folks become Scrum Masters. We put the entire division, every developer went through Scrum training, and we said we are doing Scrum as a company. We dedicated ourselves to it, and we sat down. We started to ask ourselves what was done. We started to realize how little we had been doing in the past, which was interesting. But more interestingly, how much work needs to be done made us feel like we were getting less done. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we were concerned when looking at Scrum that what we perceived as the most important piece of work, the code, was getting squeezed, and we're going to spend all this time writing documentation and doing tests and things like that. Is that a common perception that someone says that, well, gosh, the speed at which we're getting things done is less because look, we're having to do all this administrivia.
Yes.
Just to make someone feel like we are done.
I believe in every programmer's head there's a little person who has a metronome, and the metronome goes at a certain pace. And if we don't go at that pace, then we're falling behind.
Right, I agree.
And so if we take the time to actually test our code, and this is the whole range of testing it, and perhaps even document it to make sure that it works as documented, then we're not going as fast as we should. And at that point, we kind of panic and we throw all that stuff over the board. We'll say, we'll do that later because that's not really customer stuff. That's other stuff.
Right. Administration. It's just administrivia, we called it.
Right. Well, acceptance test driven development blows all this out the water because you're defining the acceptance test that will prove whether it works right up the front. And then you go off and you document it. You set up the tests for it. You set up the code for it. And then you try to see whether it works as the test described and works as the documentation describes. And that's a complete piece of code. If it's not, you circle back and get it complete. If it is, then you go back and pick up another piece of code. Now, that's talking about everything that's customer facing being done within a piece of word called done.
It seems to me like programmers and engineers are deeply interested in delivering code. And if we're not slapping the keyboard and making our curly braces or whatever language we're using, we're not productive. But that means that we're fundamentally disconnecting with the whole point, which is to make a happy customer.
Well, this goes to the point of a flaw, almost a genetic flaw that has occurred in programmers that's come out from waterfall.
Mm-hmm.
And this is that we are willing to cut quality to increase velocity or to increase that drum beat that the little person has in her head.
Exactly.
And so I can sit at a desk and I can do things the right way, maybe think about how something's supposed to be done and where it'll fit in the design and what I have to refactor to do and then the coding for it, the tests. And that might take me an hour. But if someone tells me that this is really important, and I've got a deadline to meet, and stop fooling around, this is really serious, I can do that same work in 10 minutes by only doing the coding and slapping it onto something rather than refactoring it. So that's where we come up with the idea that only the code is what matters.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, what this results in then, because we've cut the definition of done, is a done deficit or an undone, which is where we, strangely enough, get our things like high maintenance, low sustainability software.
It feels like there is a synergy between the Scrum methodology and what has been happening in productivity with David Allen's getting things done way of thinking. It's kind of like the new Stephen Covey. I'm not sure if you're familiar with David Allen's getting things done. It's called GTD.
Yep.
And it's been the whole concept of his productivity style is that one has a mental backlog of all the things that are causing you psychic weight, is what he calls it. And psychic weight can be everything in your life, from write some code to clean out the garage. And you can't release that psychic weight until you've actually written it down, and that's backlog items. Put every single thing that needs to be done. Then you can release that because it's in a trusted source. And then the most important thing about his solution, which I think can be applied to something like Scrum, is what is the next action required to move this thing forward? Not at the project level, but what is the very next action? For example, if I'm going to paint my house.
Yes.
That's my backlog item, paint my house. What is the very next action required? Well, it might be something very trivial like get the phone number of the painter.
But it's what I know what it has to be, rather than me looking for any paint that I can find under the table and starting to paint.
Exactly. But the programmer's mind wants to let's just start painting. I've got some paint.
Right.
Let's just start slapping paint on the wall. It'll work itself out.
Well, the most suspicious thing in any organization are teams that have a velocity of 10, 12. That might be the average within the organization. But another team is able to get a velocity of 20, 25. Amazingly, if you look at their code and the tests around it, they have changed the definition of done to increase that.
So say something about velocity, because I don't think necessarily all of our listeners are familiar with the concept and the numbers associated with velocity.
Well, if we have a list of things that a customer wants to have done, this is how many of those things we're able to get done as a team over a period of time, which might be like a monthly iteration. So velocity might be 20 pieces of requirements or a product backlog that we're going to get done over a sprint. Now, if you are able to change the definition of done to minimize testing, to minimize design, to minimize refactoring, you can raise that incredibly. However, if within an organization everyone has the same definition of done and it's something that's potentially shippable, then I can really compare one team to another.
Interesting. And I think that idea of having a common agreement across either groups or divisions makes the statistics have value. Otherwise, they're useless. They're just numbers.
They are useless. And an interesting way of making it so the statistics are relevant is all the teams that are working on a similar set of software, let's say a similar release of software, have to have the same definition of done. Otherwise, their code won't integrate during the sprint and won't be integrated at the end of the iteration or sprint. And so this becomes an organization-wide definition rather than just simply for a single team.
Let's just take a moment right now to thank our sponsors, and we'll come right back with Ken Schwaber, and we'll talk a little bit more about what is done. Do you know how to make the possible out of the impossible? Well, the .NET Ninjas at Telerik do. They just released a huge pack of web controls all built on top of ASP.NET Ajax that'll help you build impossibly fast and interactive applications in no time at all. They've made the impossible possible in desktop development. If you think you can't have a carousel component in WinForms, well, you can. Their Windows Forms suite features a super powerful grid view control and 32 other crazy desktop components that'll give you dazzling WPF-like features, but in WinForms. They do the same thing in reporting solutions with a new design surface like nothing else. Looks just like graph paper. Gives you advanced page layout capabilities. Makes it feel more like a graphic design software than a reporting solution. Go check them out at Telerik.com and be a .NET Ninja. And thanks for listening. This week's Hansel Minutes is brought to you by CodeBetter.com, the CodeBetter.com blog network. It's made up of over 20 industry leaders and speakers who are passionate about delivering tried-and-true solutions to real-world problems for building better software. These guys are not only our sponsor this week, but they're also my friends. The CodeBetter blog network, it's where industry leaders blog. You can find them at CodeBetter.com, as well as Devlicious, DEVLICIO.us. And we're back. We're talking to Ken Schwaber about what is done. And you were going to say something, sir, about the relationship that happens between the customer and the developer and how the definition of done can affect that relationship.
Yes, we've talked about how done is necessary so a team knows how many items to select and so it knows what development process it goes through within a sprint to create something, and so that there is no undone work left at the end of the project for the team to stabilize. However, this changes a long-term and long-time honored relationship between customers, who we now call product owners, and the developers on the Scrum team. Normally, a product owner would come in if they needed something more done than they had anticipated in a project, and they would tell the team, hey, we've got some more things, we've got some more stuff for our customers, we've got some more functionality that we need to get into this release, and it's just critical. And the team would look up and say, well, yeah, but we don't have any more time to do that. And the product owner would look them even more clearly in the face and say, you don't understand, this is really, really important. And the team would say, oh, now we understand. It's that important that, if we don't do it, you're going to go to our managers, and we're all in deep trouble if we don't do it. So at this point in time, the development team does what it always has done in this relationship, which is it cuts quality. That is, it reduces the amount of stuff that is included in what's done to simply increase the amount of stuff that can be claimed as done. And as I mentioned earlier, they can vastly increase their velocity by doing this. They might increase it by up to 4 or 5, certainly enough to accommodate almost any increase in things that a customer or product owner is asking for. I think this has led to a deep-seated belief by all of our customers that in general, we sit around as developers with our feet up on a desk, maybe playing with, or surfing the web or looking at pornography or doing something, but it's certainly not doing the work that they want. And it's all they have to do is tell us that it's really important for us to do it, and we will put our feet down and we'll sit forward and we'll really crank out the code like we always have. What they don't know is that we've cut quality by reducing the definition of done to do it. So this changes the relationship between the product owner and the team. The team now has a definition of done. The definition of done is something that is potentially shippable. This is something which is full quality, it's maintainable, sustainable, enhanceable code. And yet the product owner doesn't necessarily know about this, and so they'll come to the team and say, guys, you got to get more done. And the team can't. The team is stuck with the definition of done, and so their velocity is fairly static. You can't change your velocity by more than 5-10% within any sprint by any technique other than cutting quality. Adding people won't do it. Increasing your engineering tools won't do it. So they have to really look back at the product owner and say, excuse me, but this is our definition of done. We can't do any more. So with the definition of done being in place, the team can no longer produce more by reducing the definition of done. This leaves the product owner with the question of how do they get changes taken care of? How do they get the work that they're used to asking the team to do at the last minute done? Scrum gives the product owner, the customer, another variable that they can work with that they've never had before. This is the ability to iteratively, incrementally build the product. In the past, they've had to say, this is everything we want. Here it is. Do it. And then later come in and say, oh, by the way, and do this more. Now what the product owner can do is they can ask for the product to be built piece by piece by piece. Highest value piece, next highest value piece, next highest value piece. And when they get done with all the functionality they think is valuable, they can stop. So this means that at any point in time, they can trade off functionality that's in the queue to be built with other functionality that's more valuable. This works extremely well when you take two industry statistics into account. One is 35% of all functionality changes during a release. So this is 35% of the queue of work that a product owner had wanted before that's open for change. And 50 to 60% of all functionality in any release is rarely or never needed. So what we've given our product owners is the ability to piece by piece manage what they're getting in the release so they can constantly optimize the value and the return on investment. They will never do this as long as they're used to believing that all they have to do is tell the developers to do more and the team will. They'll only do this when they believe that that's not an option and they have to optimize the value of the release rather than just trying for more and more and more. This is a big change for our customers. This is a big change for our developers. Simply by introducing the value of the word done, we have changed the relationship, and we've also started to increase the quality, sustainability, and maintainability of our products.
Now, you talked about the prioritization and the deciding that what I need to get done, once I've defined what done is, I can say I want the most high-value things first. How do those business needs and ranking the order in which I want to finish my backlog items, how can those constraints be reconciled with architecturally to finish this most important business thing? We require this, these designs or this underlayment, or I simply can't do priority 1 thing before priority 5 because of the way that I see the design in my head. The natural value order of the business need may not necessarily be friendly to the architecture.
Right. Usually we're used to thinking of architecture as being done before we start developing the software, and then we hang the software from the architecture and the infrastructure. If we're listing the work that the customer wants done, we're listing the requirements they want. We're also listing the non-functional requirements that are needed to support the functional requirements at the pace, at the security, at the other requirements that they need. So those are top priority product backlog items that need to be done. In Scrum, every sprint has to have at least one piece of business functionality. So in the very first sprint, we might have one piece of business functionality and a lot of architectural, infrastructural items being built. In the second sprint, we might have a little more business functionality and a little less architectural, infrastructural work being done. This means that in every sprint, some of the architecture and infrastructure is going in, but it emerges. We don't build it up front all at once. We let it emerge based on the business requirements. This means at any point in time, we'll never have more architecture than the business functionality that we built demands. It also, though, means that the code that we write had better be very clean, very refactored, and very well documented. Otherwise, when we get to the second sprint and we try laying more code on top of it, we will have a bloody mess.
I see. So the more appropriately factored your code is, the more friendly it is to being the code itself being agile enough to be modified for future requirements.
Exactly. And this is where that word done really comes into play, because if you take a shortcut with Scrum, it's going to catch up with you within 3 or 4 sprints, not 3 or 4 releases.
So what about cross-cutting concerns around things like security throughout and logging throughout, and things that don't, the kinds of backlog items that one finds hanging around sprint after sprint? Maybe they're poorly written backlog items because they're something like logging.
Yeah, so you might have logging as a product backlog item in the first sprint, and it's logging for this one piece of functionality. So you're only putting enough to do that one piece. Then in the second sprint, you're doing logging for another piece, then third piece. Or you might take logging and break it down into the customer needs logging, and we will be logging at this type of capability. So you decompose it further and further, so you're putting in just enough to support the business requirement.
What about when a requirement takes a dramatic right turn in a direction that you maybe didn't see? Someone builds a logging infrastructure to log to text files. Suddenly, the customer changes the requirement. We need to log into the cloud, and we're just simply not prepared for that.
We wouldn't have been prepared if we had tried thinking through the architecture up front. The only difference is that we won't have built a lot of things that we have to tear apart. Instead, we will be able to just start from where we are.
I see. So I'm hearing you say that it's that accidental complexity that comes from trying to think too much about the architecture, what we might need.
Yes.
As opposed to being driven by exactly what we are told we need.
If we look historically, we're driven to build architecture and infrastructure at the start of the project. And if you're using waterfall, that's because if you change any requirement at the start of the project, it only costs you $1. 60% of the way through the project, since we build all the architecture and infrastructure at the start, it might cost us $100. So we try to be perfect up front. If we're using the ideas of refactoring and emergent architecture, then we don't need to be perfect. We're constantly adjusting it to meet the requirements. However, this does require tremendously good engineering skills, which removes your ability to devolve from the word done into some crap.
And it removes your ability to fake it.
Completely. If you try faking it within 4 sprints, you'll be caught.
Yeah, interesting.
So suddenly you have a reason to write really good software, and you always have a reward for writing really good software.
It's interesting. A number of people have said to me that I've said this before, that Agile is, some people are using it as an excuse to be sloppy, but I've found when I've been working with really good Scrum Masters, it's a much more formal process than really any process I've ever worked on.
It has consequences at the end of every sprint if everyone's paying attention. The Scrum Master is the one we hold responsible for the product owner knowing what's being seen at the end of the sprint. If the definition of done is that something will be completely done and tested, the Scrum Master is not allowed to let the product owner see something that does not meet that criteria. So they're like the judge, the referee in a football game.
So that brings up an interesting question. What does a failed sprint look like, and what do we do about it?
Failed sprint is an awful phrase. Sprints don't fail or succeed. Things simply happen within them.
Okay.
So if we select some product backlog items which have a lot of architectural work in it, and we don't get done with that within a sprint because it turns out bigger than we thought, we will re-estimate the amount of work remaining on those items and put them back in the product backlog. Hopefully the product owner will reselect them for the next sprint, but they are not done. They are not demonstrable. Simply there remains less work to be done on them.
But can it be possible that one would have a sprint, and either because of the length of the sprint or the inappropriate size of the backlog items, that they have nothing that they can demonstrate at the end of the sprint?
Yes, absolutely. Wonderful. Then we sit down with them and say, wow, that was really pretty terrible. So how can we now select a more appropriate amount? Typically, teams will, by the time they get into their third sprint, know how much they can select and how much they can do within a sprint. It tends to be a self-learning process.
So when a team is deciding to start using Scrum, they don't have to necessarily take it all at once, right? They can just pick something and try to improve that.
Absolutely. And often when they think they're doing it all at once and perfectly, they will discover that they're not, and what they do have to improve.
What kind of preparation should they make for management in the sense of we're not going to become immediately and incredibly effective just because we've moved from one process to Scrum? What can they do to prepare? I mean, how much overhead is there for the startup of an Agile practice at a previously not Agile shop?
None. If you prepare, you will be preparing what you think is the most important stuff to prepare. And you have no idea what the teams are really going to need. So far better to let a team start with some product backlog that they can find somewhere and do their best to turn it into something that's done by the end of a sprint. And in the process of doing this, you'll find everything that they don't know, everything they need to know, and those then become the things that you can put in place to help them.
Oh, so it sounds like the only overhead is just the act of deciding.
Deciding, yep.
This is kind of a Schrodinger's cat view of Agile, where you're not going to know until you just open the box.
Absolutely. And this, I think, translates back into, again, the waterfall approach of let's plan it and get it perfect before we start, versus the Scrum approach, which says there's so much complexity you can never know what's needed, so just start, and then you'll know what you need. Feels far riskier, but in Scrum, your risk is never greater than one sprint.
Very cool. Well, that's all the time we've got, and I thank you so much for sitting down with me today, Ken Schwaber, and we'll see you again next week on Hansel Minutes.
Thank you.